of church and state. And thank you. So, this is actually a pretty hot topic. So, I mean, just out of curiosity, I know one of you knows what it means. Anybody else just heard the term?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, know what it means? Sort of, kinda. That's why we're here. Okay, so, well, let's open with prayer, why don't we? So, our Lord, we do ask you that you would lead us, guide us, help us to think, ponder, and consider what truths you would have for us. Watch over us. We pray in your name. Amen. So yeah, I mean, it's this can be a controversial topic. So this morning, so we have 2 Sundays on this. This morning, I'm going to give a few introductory slides, and then I'm going to let someone else speak, and you can throw rocks at her. So, but I'll introduce on a YouTube video. So I'll make a few introductory comments, and then we'll do that. So let's see if I can do this. Okay, so first I want to start with a more general topic about religious nationalism. Let me try to get this going so I can see at the same time. So, so religious nationalism tends to come as a package. It's like culture, ethnicity, religion gets bundled up together and kind of merges with politics to form a national identity. Pardon? It can be, I've got some examples, but it can be basically here. I mean, we're going to get around to Christianity, but here it's like it happens generally. And so you're a good straight man. You're leading me right into the next points. So so extreme forms of religious nationalism, the ethnic cleansing, like persecution, extermination of those that don't have the accepted ethnicity, cultural, religious identity. So, so examples: Nazi Germany, the German Lutheran Church. It's interesting that the Soviet Union and Russia have been. So the Soviet Union was basically the religion of atheism. So they enforced, it's like the religious commitment was to the state. And so that kind of replaced God. You know, Bosnia is pretty famous for Slobodan Milosevic and ethnic cleansing. Syria, I mean, ISIS, obviously. India, Pakistan, you know, the Hindus and the Muslims there. Lots of African countries have and still to this day are engaging in some of this. You could probably say the Israelis and the Palestinians, because religion, national identity, culture, ethnicity is a package with that whole thing going on over there. Ku Klux Klan. Ku Klux Klan purported to be a Christian organization. You know, Myanmar, the Uyghurs. Anybody know who the Uyghurs are? It's a Muslim minority in China that's being supposedly persecuted. And then the Shinto religion in Japan was kind of bundled up with the Japanese. It's particularly, you know, prior to World War II, that whole ethno-cultural religious package all came together as a bundle. And so there was definitely religious nationalism going on in Japan at the Second World War. So what I updated, yes. So lesser forms have led to oppression of minority populations. Just a note. So it can be anywhere from extermination and ethnic cleansing to just oppression. So I want to talk a minute about and clarify patriotism versus religious nationalism. So patriotism obviously is a good thing, right? So we teach our kids to be patriotic, to love their country, say the Pledge of Allegiance. So it can be loving all the good things and then working diligently to change the things that we think can be better. So patriotism is certainly a positive thing. I'm going to put out some quotes here by a guy named Paul Miller, who wrote an article in Christianity Today, and he's a Georgetown scholar. But he and Christianity Today is a pretty mainstream kind of evangelical magazine. I thought, hey, good place to quote from. So he said, nationalism starts with the belief that humanity is divisible to mutually distinct, internally coherent cultural groups defined by shared traits like language, religion, ethnicity, or culture. From there, scholars say nationalists believe these groups should each have their own governments, but government should promote and protect a nation's cultural identity, that sovereign national groups provide meaning and purpose for human beings. So I wanted to at least clarify that patriotism, like you can be any cultural group, any identity, and be a blank American, so whatever it is. You can agree or disagree, but still love the country. But nationalism, again, has this package of culture, language, religion, all bound up as a power center. So now I would like to, I know Susan has looked at this. I don't know if anybody else has, but this woman, Amanda Tyler, spoke at First Presbyterian Church in Richardson. And I have a YouTube video of her talk, and we're going to listen to some of it. And we may stop at some point, but she has an undergraduate degree from Georgetown University. Has a law degree from, don't hold it against her, University of Texas. But she is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C., a nonprofit whose focus is defending religious freedom for all people. And so, and she says during her talk, I don't remember if it's during the segment that we see, that she has worked with the PCUSA. So she's essentially a lobbyist for the Baptist Church, but it's an independent organization. But when she says defending religious freedom for all people, we'll probably talk at some point about, this idea of like religious liberty and whatever. So it can either mean one group gets their rights, or it can mean everybody equally, has the free access to practice their religion. And that's the free access of anyone to practice their religion is what she's advocating. Yes. Yep. Muslim or Hindu American. Yeah. So it can be, so we're specifically going to talk about, I wanted to put it in a broader context because like specifically here, we're going to be talking about how that plays out in the Christian world, but it can be, like you say, it can be any religion. Obviously you think about the Taliban, I mean, that's pretty much a good example of religious nationalism from a Muslim standpoint. So you queued up to about 13 and a half. Yeah. So that's Amanda Tyler at First Pres Richardson. And I'm gonna let her talk for a while. And
to dismantle it, and what kind of vision do we have for a society that exists without Christian
who's
nationalism?
talking? Oh, she is.
Before I get into some definitions or understandings, I think from the beginning, one of the goals of the campaign is to answer this question: what is Christian nationalism, and how do we recognize it? But first, I wanted to look at a broader definition of religious nationalism, which I'm going to define today as a fusion of national and religious identities and goals, and state that it's been a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. So we're going to zoom in a moment on Christian nationalism in the US context, but first I want to think about the broader issue of religious nationalism. When it comes to religious nationalism as far as a merger of Christianity and nation, I think historically we can go all the way back to Constantine. You know, the first time that a political ruler actually identified Christianity as the religion for the entire group of people, in that case, the empire. But there have been other examples from other faith traditions of religious nationalism throughout history, and we can look around the world today and name other examples of religious nationalism around the world, including in Russia, India, Hungary, a number of African countries, including Zambia, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. And we can also see religious nationalism present in the incredibly complicated conflict that is happening right now between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So religious nationalism is a world problem. So I want us to think now more specifically about Christian nationalism in the American context, but to know that it is not disconnected from these other examples of religious nationalism. So this QR code, by the way, will take you to the ChristiansAgainstChristianNationalism.org website, where there are all these materials, many of which I'm going to talk about here today. But if you want to be able to get there quickly, you can use the camera function on your phone to go there as well. So the definition that I'd like to provide for Christian nationalism, and the one that we use at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, is this. Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. Christian nationalism, in other words, says that to be a real American, one has to be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, but specifically a white Christian who holds certain fundamentalist religious beliefs that are often in line with certain conservative political priorities. That is the true American, and that everyone else has inherently second-class citizen status, that they don't fully belong as full Americans if they don't have that religious identity. Now, some markers of Christian nationalism are these. One, Christian nationalism relies very heavily on this mythological history of America as a quote-unquote Christian nation. Now, I want to pause there because sometimes this kind of gets hung up. Well, it depends on what you mean by a Christian nation. I mean, if you're describing the United States from a demographic perspective, for most of our history, the majority of people in the United States have identified as Christian. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't always mean that a majority of the people in the United States have not always gone to church. A majority of the people in the United States have not been from one kind of Christian perspective, but there has been a majority of Americans who are Christian. But that's not, when people say America is a Christian nation, that is not typically what they mean. Rather, they mean that America was founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity in law and policy and society. Sometimes it comes out by saying things like the founding documents were divinely inspired, or our laws are based on Christian values or sometimes Judeo-Christian values. That Christianity was inherent in that God's providential hand has been guiding America through history all the way up into the present, and that America plays a special role in God's plan for the world. These are all examples of the Christian nation story that Christian nationalism relies so heavily on. In some ways, Christian nationalism is an exaggerated form and overlaps with American exceptionalism and other stories such as the doctrine of discovery. This idea that God wanted to use white Europeans or Europeans who came here in order to further God's plan for the world. And so Europeans had a divine mandate to take land, to enslave Africans, to do all of those things, that those were all part of God's plan for the world. And that story is all kind of baked in to this Christian nation narrative and to Christian nationalism itself. Now, Christian nationalism has been around for a long time, but the term, as it is being used in sociology and in media and in presentations like this, it is relatively new. I would say over the last 15 years, really, Christian nationalism has been used to describe this package of beliefs that has been around for a long time. And over the last several years, there have been a number of social science surveys that have tried to measure Christian nationalism in the public. And this started with a couple of sociologists of religion who worked together. Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead published a book in 2020 called Taking America Back for God. And then there have been other studies since then by PRRI and the Brookings Institution, as well as Pew, that have tried to measure for Christian nationalism in the culture. And so I wanted to give you some of the kind of top line of how Christian nationalism is being measured and what some of the studies have shown. One thing all of these surveys do, they use similar questions to test for Christian nationalism in the culture. And it comes very much off of these markers. Some of the questions have to do with how much a respondent desires the U.S. to declare itself a Christian nation, or whether it is important that laws reflect Christian values. And then they measure Christian nationalism along a continuum. And so this is, I think, very important when we talk about Christian nationalism. It is not a diagnosis. It is not something that you either have or you don't. It is rather like racism, an ideology that you either ascribe to, you're moving towards, or you reject, you're moving away from. And it is something that we all have a continuing opportunity to either embrace or reject on a daily basis. It is not something, it is something that moves and is not static. And so all of these surveys measure a particular group of people at a particular point in time. So I think that the trends are really instructive and help understand how prevalent Christian nationalism really is in American society. So just to give you a little bit of language about this, some of these surveys, Whitehead and Perry in particular, their continuum of Christian nationalism is at one end rejectors, and then at the other end ambassadors. Okay, so people who totally reject Christian nationalism and the ideas that go with it, and the ambassadors are those who most embrace it. Here locally, an example of an ambassador of Christian nationalism would be Robert Jeffress, the pastor of First Baptist Church of Dallas, who has actually taken out billboards here that say, "America is a Christian nation." Okay, so I think that is kind of the quintessential example of an ambassador of Christian nationalism. But then in between, you have people who are resisting Christian nationalism or accommodating it. The PRRI study uses very similar terms. They have rejectors at one end, adherents on the other, and then in the middle, skeptics and sympathizers. Okay, so now that you have some of that language, here are some of the trends. In all of these studies, the smallest group of people on these continuums are those who most embrace Christian nationalism. The smallest number of people are the ambassadors or the adherents. Now, it still shows up to be somewhere between 10 and 20% of the population. So that is not a small amount of people, but it is the smallest group on the scale. And so I think in some ways that can be encouraging to us, that it's not larger than it is, but still concerning that many people are firmly thinking that America should be a Christian nation, that Christianity should be reflected in law and policy, and that Christianity should be favored. So that's where that is. But the largest group are the people in the middle, those middle people who haven't totally rejected it and aren't completely out there pushing it, but are somehow accommodating it or just kind of skeptical about Christian nationalism. And so I think that this information helps us understand that this is not something that's just out there. It's in every social situation that we're in. It's in every faith community. It's in every neighborhood. It's in every place, that it's not just a group of people who are labeled as Christian nationalists, but rather a pervasive problem throughout the country. And so I just want to give you, this is the latest data on Christian nationalism. This is from the PRRI study that came out just earlier this year. And they interviewed more than 22,000 adults, and it was for the first time the ability to estimate support for Christian nationalism in all 50 states. They found that roughly 30%, 3 in 10 Americans, are either adherents of Christian nationalism or sympathizers with Christian nationalism. That those numbers are pretty stable since they first started asking this question in 2022. And then they looked nationwide, and some of this might not be surprising to you. They found that residents of red states are significantly more likely than those in blue states to hold Christian nationalist beliefs. They found the highest level of support for Christian nationalism in the upper Midwest, and then in the deep South, and then moving up again through the Appalachian Mountains. And the 5 states that had the highest incidence of Christian nationalism, and these are people who, the highest numbers of people who are either adherents or sympathizers with it, are North Dakota. 50% of the people in their survey from North Dakota were either adherents or sympathizers. Mississippi, 50%. Alabama, 47%, West Virginia, 47%, and Louisiana, 46%. You may be surprised to learn, as I was, that Texas was actually much lower than other red states in the amount of Christian nationalism in the society. It was at 34%, so closer to the national average than other red states. There were also numbers, and I encourage you to go, if you're really interested, to go look at the PRI numbers first for digging more deeply. Sometimes people talk about Christian nationalism. Well, is this only a problem in white evangelical churches? And the answer is, it is not only a problem there, but it is the biggest problem in white evangelical churches. So they found that majorities of 2 religious groups hold Christian nationalist beliefs higher than in other groups, that majorities of them do. Among white evangelical Protestants, 2/3, or 66%, were either adherents or sympathizers to Christian nationalism, and among Hispanic Protestants, 55%. But among all other religious groups that were surveyed, they were all less than 55. They were all less than half, less than 50%, but they were still somewhat strong in those communities. So that's why I say this is not just a problem with white evangelical Protestantism. It is a problem in every religious community. I think this is a really important point for us to consider as we think about, and this is kind of where I started, as we think about how dangerous Christian nationalism is. PRRI found that those who are most adhering to Christian nationalism are more likely than other Americans to see political struggles through the apocalyptic lens of revolution and to support political violence. And this, I think, is what we saw on display on January 6, 2021, because we saw how Christian nationalism was used in that political event to galvanize people, to infuse what was a political cause with religious fervor. And we saw that with a lot of the imagery that was on display on January 6th, in the way that people prayed when they came into to the Senate chamber that day and were trying to bless their actions as being done in accordance with the will of God. But I just wanted to share with these really alarming findings from this study. They found that a majority of Christian nationalism adherents, 54%, and 45% of sympathizers agree that, quote, there is a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders. They also found that those same people were about twice as likely as other Americans to believe that political violence may be justified. Nearly 4 in 10 Christian nationalism adherents and 1/3 of sympathizers agree that, quote, because things have gotten so off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save the country. And so this is, I think, one place where we have to be very alert to the overlap between Christian nationalism and calls for political violence. I want to turn
Could you pause it
now
right there for a
to
second?
how
No.
Christian.
So, remember when Doug Fox used to say, well, so, but we should stop and talk for a second. So that was a lot. That was kind of a fire hose of stuff. So, reactions, that was a lot. Say more about that. Okay, yeah. But yeah. So Brad said it's kind of violates separation of church and state. So, which yeah, correct. Right, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. And so and I don't know if we'll probably we'll get to it this week, but it's like I want to have some conversation about what did the founders intend with religion and pluralism. So yeah.
I knew it was a revolving, it's a
Mm.
small,
Mm,
and it's just the ones who adhere.
mm,
But when you hear the skepticism
Mhm.
or
mm,
that large,
mm,
it's not a, everyone keeps saying, oh, it's a small group of people. It's not,
mm,
it's not fringe.
mm.
It's not.
Well, she said too, it's a spectrum. I mean, it's like, because I mean, on the surface, there are a lot of pieces of it that on the surface, I mean, the comment about, America is a Christian nation. I mean, and she said, well, demographically, most people profess some kind of Christianity. But then you get into, okay, so does that mean that the official American religion should be Christianity? Or not? So she put it up on the slide about the belief that the like Declaration of Independence and Constitution were divinely inspired. And so that's a whole nother conversation. So, but what does it mean for Christian? Well, I've got a slide later on about, Christian engagement in the public sector. I mean, she obviously advocates Christians being engaged in the public sector, but it's like, but this is the great question. What do you mean by that? What are you supposed to be doing? Pardon? Uh, she's an attorney. Yeah, she's basically a lobbyist for religious liberty. Working for, when she says religious liberty, she means basically every religion gets equal rights. I mean, there's no one religion that should dominate other religions. Yeah, 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 yeah. We don't establish a religion. So yeah, and but yeah, but yeah, yes, but yeah. Yeah, that's yeah, the notion that and she mentioned, it's kind of a hand grenade, but she said January 6th that and if you just simply look at the video without commentary, it's like there were a lot of people holding, Jesus, and there were people praying and in the Capitol, and so there was absolutely a Christian component to that event. So um, so yeah, so
Me is the thing that, we started out. Our revolution and, from the Pilgrims till then, there's 100 years, many groups came from mostly Northern Europe,
Mhm.
but all of them disliked the religious environment they were coming from.
Mhm.
They didn't like the Church of England, and
Mhm.
so they rejected the Church of England. and
Right.
Catholic Church dominated, so they came
Mhm.
here, they didn't like the Catholic Church in government.
Right, right.
So those 100 years, separation of church and state was very important to all the new immigrants. They came here for freedom to get away from church
Mhm.
and state.
Religious persecution, and
Yeah.
there were some,
Yeah,
like the Massachusetts, I think, tried to set up a theocracy, Puritan theocracy, and said, it's like, no, we want to do this. And, yeah, so we keep trying to go back and do that. So, but yeah, it's one of the basic ideas, the notion of a theocracy versus a pluralistic society. Yes, Barb. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So she said, don't forget the Native Americans. Yeah, yeah. I just came back from Washington, Oregon, and drove out there, and I completely inadvertently, without planning it, I followed partly the Missouri River going up and then the Columbia River going west. And so Lewis and Clark was, I was following the path of Lewis and Clark, and then back before, everybody started moving west. They had a little economy there where, the indigenous tribes were just trading partners. It's like the French trappers were in there, and we were in there, and the army was in there, and the native populations were in there, but they're all, kind of like at that time, everybody was equal. And they decided, no, we want your stuff and your land, so we're going to push you to places that nobody else really wants. So, but yeah. Another go. Big Sit Indian School, yeah, yeah, right. Yeah. Mm. And I see another hand over here too, buddy. No, but yes. Uh, oh, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, Barb said her mother had a fear of going to Indian schools. And so I guess that was kind of a part of the milieu at the time. I guess I know some of the Indian schools were probably attempts to proselytize. And yeah. Mhm. Yeah, 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 yeah. And under whatever American culture was. So yeah, yeah. Right, yeah. Yeah. So, and it kind of eliminated Native American culture. So,
As a interesting point, the Mormons viewed the Indians as relatives. I mean, it started with the Lamanites and the Nephites, and they were the original Mormons in the United States in this area. So that's one of the reasons why the Mormons were safely able to travel to Salt Lake City and settled there, because they treated the Indians as part of their culture, part of the descendants of their religion.
yeah, I think the Book of Mormon says Jesus appeared to the Native Americans. So it's in the Book of Mormon. So, but yeah, very interesting. But I did, this is a complete aside, but I think it was in Idaho. I saw a Mormon temple. And it looked exactly like the pictures of the one they want to build in, was it Frisco? I think, but it's a very pretty building, very well landscaped. So, but choir people. So any other questions or comments? I can let her talk for another few minutes, but she threw a lot of hand grenades there, and I just wanted to see what people were thinking and feeling about what she was saying. So I think so. Yeah, First Pres Richardson. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I was just gonna, say something about this. We do Bible study in here, and unless you almost put this thing in your mouth, they don't hear you on the other end anyway. So,
Okay,
so if you get it,
yeah,
put it up close to
Right.
your mouth.
yeah, yeah. Okay. So any other questions? I'll let her, we got a few more minutes. I'll let her talk for another minute. Yes, Herb. Oh.
They, some of them were deist.
Yep.
And some of them
Yep.
didn't follow Jesus Christ, but they were godly people. They had the same general outlook.
Right,
But it's not, I don't think it's accurate to say they were Christian. Thomas Jefferson, for one.
right. Yeah, he wrote his own New Testament and cut out all the parts he didn't like.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All the quotes from Jesus he cut
Yeah.
out.
And so, yeah, it's a huge, what do you mean by that when you say
Yeah.
Christian? It's, is it their principles of justice and compassion and love, or they're people that go all the way? I mean, next week I'll talk about, there's some people that believe that, that Christians should enforce, the law of Moses today. And, to an extreme level. So,
That's
Um,
hardly Christian if it's the Moses, right?
you would think, you would think that would be obvious. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, another thing with the Constitution is like and, Kevin can chime in, but as I understand, the fight over slavery almost derailed the Constitutional Convention. And so that's where they ended up with a compromise of a slave as 3/5 of a person. And so, and I think it's still in there, so, yeah, but I know. Man, but, so, well, I'm gonna let her, so, look, nobody's walked out other than just going to choir, so, and hosting, yeah, so, so I'm gonna let her, so, I'm gonna go back and let's let her talk for another, we got a few more minutes, let's let her talk a few more minutes and see what kind of
Christian nationalism
grenades
overlaps
come up.
with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial
Oh, there's a hand grenade.
subjugation. Now, some people, when you hear Christian nationalism, sometimes people will call it exclusively white Christian nationalism. And I'll tell you why I opt usually for the term Christian nationalism, though I do want to talk about white Christian nationalism here. I think sometimes if you hear just Christian nationalism, or I'm sorry, if you just hear white Christian nationalism, it might send the signal that you have to be white to be an adherent to Christian nationalism. And that's simply not the case. We see adherents of Christian nationalism in all different racial and ethnic categories that are surveyed in these different surveys, that people who identify as Black or Latino or Asian or any of the other categories that are given in the surveys, that they are also falling all along that spectrum of Christian nationalism. And so I think it's really important that we think about Christian nationalism not just as being a problem in white communities. Now, it is more of a problem, just like we noted it is more of a problem in the white evangelical communities, it is also more of a problem in white communities. But what I really want to center in on, though, is how Christian nationalism is often used as a cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And that's because this Christian nation myth that we talked about earlier creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging that is limited to the people who held power when the country was founding. And those are white, Protestant, Christian men who owned property. That those people are given the highest level of cultural belonging and everyone else is on a different status. And just like Christian nationalism has been a recurrent problem, white Christian nationalism has been a recurrent problem. And we can see from our past the KKK as a very stark example of white Christian nationalism with its toxic mix of white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and violence. And so I don't believe that we can talk about Christian nationalism without also talking about white supremacy. And it is vital that when we're having conversations about it, that we think about those things together. When I talk about Christian nationalism, though, I also want to talk about what Christian nationalism is not. And so I want to talk about the difference between Christian nationalism and Christianity. Christian nationalism is a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus. Christian nationalism takes the central message of Christianity, which is a gospel of love, and turns it into a false idol of power. And it is also idolatrous in that Christian nationalism tries to merge religious authority and political authority together in ways that confuse the two and that can lead to worship of the state or putting the state's goals over and above our religious identities and our religious convictions. The Christian in Christian nationalism is much more about identity, and particularly an ethno-national identity, than it is about any particular religion or theology. But it uses the language and the symbols of Christianity in ways that can be very confusing to a casual observer. And here's the critical part that I think is really incumbent on Christian communities to wrestle with. Because Christian nationalism and its predecessors of the doctrine of discovery and all of these other ideological makeups that really elevated whiteness and merged it into a sense of religious identity, because those are so long-standing, we have to wrestle with the ways that American Christianity has been polluted by Christian nationalism for centuries. And so, in many ways, the Christianity that we are putting into our theologies, into our worship practices, into the songs we sing, into the way even that we interpret Scripture, that it isn't such a neat distinction that Christian nationalism is not present. And so I think that is the really hard work that is incumbent on Christian communities to do, to really wrestle with how has Christian nationalism impacted our understanding of Christianity as a religion, and how can we move more closely to the teachings of Jesus and reject the false teachings of Christian nationalism. And that is work that I think is best done in religious communities and in the kind of thing that we are hoping to do with putting out resources like the curriculum that this church has been using, and a lot of other resources out there now to really grapple with the difference between the two. I also want to talk about Christian nationalism and patriotism. Now, patriotism is a very complicated topic, right? But I really want to kind of boil it down to a pretty simple definition of patriotism as a love of country. And there are many ways that people can show a love of country. They can do it in symbolic ways. That can include waving an American flag, or singing the national anthem, or doing other things that show kind of an evidence, an allegiance to, and a love of country. But patriotism is not forced. Patriotism is not a requirement. It is not a requirement that we worship our country or that we show a love for country. That is not a requirement of citizenship. Nationalism, on the other hand, is an allegiance to country that is first forced and demanded. There's no option about whether you are going to be nationalist or not. And it demands supremacy over all other allegiances, including allegiances, any kind of religious convictions we have, and any kind of allegiance that we have to Jesus. And so I think one question to ask when we're kind of wrestling with this question of, is this patriotism or is this nationalism, is to say, does my patriotism require me to sacrifice my religious convictions? And if the answer is yes, then I would say that is not patriotism. That has gone into the dangerous territory of nationalism and should be rejected. So there isn't a false choice here. You know, you don't have to, you can be patriotic while rejecting Christian nationalism. You don't have to choose between the two, but you also have to understand, I believe, personally, that there's a wide range of ways of showing your patriotism, that there's not just one way to show your patriotism. And so that can include voting, helping other people to vote, using our First Amendment freedoms, including our freedom to protest. Those are all, I believe, patriotic displays. And the kind of narrow, forced, this is the only way to be patriotic, that looks more like nationalism. And so it's really important as we dismantle Christian nationalism that we try to tell the difference between the two of these. I also want to talk about the difference between Christian nationalism and faith-based advocacy, because there is also a false choice given out there, or I think a very false criticism from those who are not liking that we're calling out Christian nationalism. Oh, well, you just want to push Christians out of the public square, or you just don't think that Christians have a right to speak up. And that is not at all the case. I mean, I am an example of a Christian who is speaking up very loudly in the public square. I am just speaking out against Christian nationalism. Robin talked about when I've testified to Congress recently. I am the only person who's ever been asked by Congress to deliver testimony on Christian nationalism, and I've done it twice. But I lead a Baptist organization, so I am a faith leader who is in the public square calling out Christian nationalism. So the very first principle in our Christians Against Christian Nationalism statement is that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. And so the problem is, as we see here on the right, the picture from January 6th, we have lots of examples of people who are claiming Christianity here with their Jesus Saves signs and other Christian symbols. We have lots of examples of Christians who are not behaving constructively in the public square, using violent actions here on January 6th to try to overthrow the results of the election. And we need more examples of Christians from all different backgrounds, and people of faith from all different backgrounds, and people who don't hold a faith tradition from all different perspectives, all of these people coming into the public square and advocating from whatever their conscience is. There's a difference between being motivated by your faith to be in the public square and by coming to the public square to insist that your certain religious view is reflected in law and policy. So that's the difference between faith-based advocacy and Christian nationalism. We can come motivated by our faith to push for certain policies, but we do so without insisting that our particular religious view be reflected in law and policy to the exclusion of other people's religious views. That's the importance of, and I believe, constructive engagement in our pluralistic system. We could talk about all kinds of ways that Christian nationalism is impacting public policy. I'm going to center into one example, and maybe some of the other examples will come up in the Q&A later, but I want to talk about how Christian nationalism is showing up in our public schools. I think we have a lot of examples right here in Texas that this is happening, but it's not just Texas, it's all over the country. I'm going to talk some about this multi-prong attack on public education and how this is being shown, how there is a cycle of how Christian nationalism fits into this cycle. So this multi-prong attack goes something like this, that we will underfund our public schools, and in doing so, sow distrust in the public schools. And when public schools don't have enough money, then they can't operate as they should. So they create a problem. And then they say, but look, public schools, you're unwilling to solve the problem. And so we have a solution. Let's have vouchers that take more money away from public schools and put them into private education. And this is a cycle that we're seeing all over the country and here in Texas as well. And so this is one public policy way that we are underfunding public schools where everyone is required to be served regardless of religious belief, and without the public schools pushing any one religion onto to their students, in favor of a system that would send public money to private schools, including to private religious schools.
Annie, why don't we go
Some
pause it
ways
there?
that Christian nationalism.
So that's, so, I mean, is this interesting? Useful? Okay. Yeah, so, a lot of stuff there. So, it was Kevin, you sitting back there going, yeah. So, yeah, it'll get started. So, yeah. Yeah, really. Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, they're, potentially controversial topics, but, you know, let's, you know, one thing I like about being a Presbyterian is we think and we talk, and we, you know, we can talk about things that, you know, that some of us might disagree about, and, but no, I'm not trying to shove anything down anybody's throat, but just helping everybody think. So, any last comments? We got a couple minutes before we knock off. So yeah.
Point that she brought out in her discussion about
Mhm.
nationalism as a term.
Mhm.
Take religious, the Christian part of that out. As a term, nationalism is it started in that is a belief that your whatever system, government, your country, whatever, is not only the best, but to the exclusion of self. So country is more important than self, which is diametrically opposite the foundation of this country.
Yeah.
And the idea of a Christian nation, most of the founding fathers were professed Christians. Most of them were members of Christian, maybe all Christian churches. But that doesn't mean that the basis for the founding documents came out of Christian belief. In fact, if you look at it more closely, it has more to do with John Locke than it does the Bible, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And to the extent that because Thomas Jefferson owned slaves during the time period, the word property was changed to the phrase pursuit of happiness.
Yep. So,
Right. So those are just a few. And then the last one, because I'm not going to be here next week. I mean, we're out of town, right?
yeah.
So the last one, the In God We Trust, was the second motto. It was
Mhm.
developed in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War as a opposition to the communist growth in Eastern Europe and other parts of the world.
Mhm.
And it was
Yep.
like, no, in God we trust. That became a motto passed by Congress.
Yeah.
So those
Yeah.
are just a few things that.
Under
that-
Eisenhower?
Yeah, it
Maybe,
was during
yeah,
Eisenhower.
Yeah.
I think it was 50, it may have been
Yeah.
54, 55, right in there.
Yeah.
And that's when that became a secondary motto.
Right.
so,
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, we could go on and on and on about a
Yeah.
lot of the stuff that's part
Yeah,
of
I
this. but I
was
just
just
wanted
reading
to
this morning about.
point that
like,
out from a historical
yeah,
standpoint.
Natural, I'm probably going to bring it up about the concept of natural rights and natural law and Hobbes and Locke. And so won't get too far into that, but so, but it's important for saying what did the founders believe? You know, you talk about originalism. It's like, well, what was Jefferson thinking when he wrote the Declaration? What was he thinking when he wrote, all men, all people, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And like, you know, like you said, he copied Locke, who said property. So, but he didn't want to upset the French. So the French were like anti-property ownership. So, but yeah, so, so yeah, so I hope that's been enlightening and just helped you think. And, but yeah, so sorry, Kevin, I'd have you, co-teach next week, but yeah, Mark was supposed to co-teach, and I think Kim saw that he was teaching and said, it's like, your daughter's having a baby. Maybe you should rethink that. So, what are you thinking? So, yeah, so, but yeah, he would have been great, but yeah, so, Oh, yeah, you know, kill the recording and,